a few more. Actually, that last bill will be. Okay, very good. Okay, good morning. Welcome to House Revenue. Miss Jeffrey, can you please take the roll?
Yes, sir. Had it right here. Lost it. Use me. Where did I put that? Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Good morning. Representative Bear,
Here.
Representative Byron,
Here.
Representative Locke,
Present.
Representative Northrup,
Here.
Representative Oakley.
Here.
Representative Storer. Oh, yes. Representative Strock,
Here.
Representative Zwanitzer, Chairman Harshman. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. We have three nice little Senate files in front of us today, so we'll work them in due time. We appreciate you being here, the sponsors. So welcome to House Revenue, Speaker Barlow, now Senator Barlow, bringing us Senate File 100. So welcome to the committee and please take us through your bill.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, committee. It's great to be here with you this morning. As you know, we're in that place where we're trading spots, bills upstairs, bills downstairs, people are coming and going. So I have another bill upstairs. I know Representative Strock has a bill upstairs in front of the committee that I'm serving on, so we'll be playing. So I will certainly stand for any questions. Doesn't look like there's a lot of people here to testify on the bill, so that means one of two things, and at least in the room. But then at some probably when you're done with me or you think you've exhausted me, I will go return to my committee duties upstairs. So, Mr. Chairman, what you have before you, Senate File 100, is fairly straightforward bill. And Mr. Chairman, could I confirm that you received a handout? Okay, thank you. So I think actually, Mr. Chairman, if I could, that's actually the way I'd like to start this explanation of the bill is what I handed out is the repealer. The repealer, which is in section 3 of the bill, excuse me, section 2. Section 2 of the bill is a repealer. So we are repealing current statute, which does this almost this entire thing with regard to wills. What we're doing with this bill with regard to wills. What this bill does is extends it to other instruments, other types of documents that you may execute in your life, such as pay upon death benefits, etc. That would be, could be, should, well, the bill would make the case they should be treated the same as a will in the case of a divorce or annulment. And so I want to be clear, current statute already does everything that this bill does for a will. Current statute already does this. What we're doing is we're taking current statute, and part of the reason you have a new bill is because drafting format, drafting conventions have changed since 1979 when this was put into statute. And we now break it down into subsections and paragraphs and other things. So that is part of the reason you have a new bill. Otherwise, you could have gotten this same statute and put in governing instrument, had that defined, etc. But our drafting convention has changed, if that makes sense. We write the book differently, if you will. The book still says the same thing, but we present it differently. So there's two reasons. So that's why I wanted to start with the repealer first. Current law does what this bill does when it regards wills. What this bill does is change the format of it and extend it to those other documents. Mr. Chairman, hopefully that's kind of an overview of the starting point. Starting point is that's already in law for wills. Secondly, why do you have and I don't know if your bill is as colorful as mine, but they ran out of the plain blue on the Senate side, just saying. I don't know if you should like it better or not. But anyway, so that's a good starting point. And as we go through this bill, I will actually say, okay, you see this bracketed, this comes almost verbatim out of current statute. This comes almost verbatim out of current statute, et cetera. There's some nuances because we're adding in we need some definitions. So Mr. Chairman, if I could, with that brief explanation, I'll just walk through the bill. Certainly this is a new and creating a new piece of statute. Remembering we're also deleting I would say analogous, maybe not as complete, but analogous piece of statute. The first 2 pages of the page 2 and into page 3 require some definitions. Actually, interestingly enough, that when we presented this bill on the House side, the Department of Health was there, vital statistics that were there. And they said nowhere in statute is divorce or annulment defined. You would think in the pile of green books that we have, we would have defined divorce and annulment. So they were actually that, hey, we actually like this because this helps us with our vital records, our vital statistics, because they also keep track of that. So for that purpose, they did come, and I don't see anybody from there here now yet. So that was so definitions. You can go through that on line 16, page 2, governing instrument. This would include a will, pay upon death benefit, a insurance policy, those type of things. The important thing is all of these instruments are revocable. Someone could change them if they so chose to. They're revocable. On to the next page, we have a definition of revocable. And then the bottom of page 3, line 17B, subsection B is where we actually start talking about the meat of the bill. And what you'll find if you compare 118, the repealed section, with from page 3 into page 4, top of page 5, that the majority of it is not identical language, but very similar language with, I would argue, the same effect. Maybe a little more completeness because we're using governing instrument, et cetera. But that's what we're doing. So in this one, same as in the current statute, it says, unless the document says otherwise, i.e. you can, if upon divorce, in your divorce decree say, hey, I want my ex-spouse to get these benefits. I want that to occur. Say you're sharing children or whatever, for whatever purpose, you can do that. If the document is silent on that, then current statute would say the divorce decree or annulment severs it. This says the same thing. So this part, there is no change in current law. The change again is expanding it to other instruments that you may execute or a married couple may execute together, and then forget, or for whatever reason, not undo upon a divorce or annulment. So that's the, so bottom of page 3, all of page 4, and I can walk, I didn't break out this document, the current statute, the same way as this is broken out, but it very easily could be into these subsections because it basically you can walk through it and see the different parts. And then on to page 4. So these are all the different things. So I'll just page 4, property, appointment, line 8, page 4, special appointments or powers. Let's say medical power of attorney, durable power of attorney, which is broader, those type of things. And then the last one, line 17 through 22, versus any kind of fiduciary responsibility, nomination for other type of responsibilities. And this is where this document is lists out things with more specificity than the current statute does. Current statute does not go into the personal representative, executor, trustee, conservator, et cetera. But certainly I believe that the current statute would be interpreted to include all of those things, if it included the governing instrument. The next page, Mr. Chairman, is how property is considered upon a divorce or a annulment. And this is where we get into that joint tenancy in common, survivorship, and all those type of things. And quite honestly, tenancies in common. And this is where it's a good thing you have attorneys to help, because this gets more confusing in my world. And certainly the good Senator Nethercott, who's in the room, you have questions about those. And you have obviously Representative Oakley as well, that deal with this on a more regular basis. They can assist with that. But basically we're saying, you know, we go away from the survivorship to you just own it together, deal with it. The next one is page 5, lines 9 through 19. This is where if there is a third party interest, mortgagee, anybody that has any other interest in the property, or this is primary property, then that survives. That does not changed by this statute. It's not changed under current law. It's certainly not going to be changed under this one. The last, let's see, bottom of page 5 and top of page 6, that's actually part of current statute, as are the next two sections, E and F on page 6. And the reason you have an engrossed copy is because of an amendment that was put on in the House. And this is the bottom of page 6, lines 15 to the end of the page, and the top of page 7. And this was brought to us by the banking industry. Saying, hey, we actually have these pay upon death type arrangements where someone passes and there's a 3-day, we get the death or we get notice. I don't know if you get a death certificate that fat, but you get notice, you have an obligation to pay fairly quickly. If we don't know that there has been a divorce or annulment, we don't want to be held liable for that. We're going to make the payment based on the best information we have, but don't put us in a jam between someone that should have got it and someone that shouldn't have gotten it. And so basically this is hopefully what we'd call they acted on the best information they have, if they are the responsible to distribute a benefit or payment. So Mr. Chairman, you'll see that the repealer, and as I provided you that in the handout, and then the provision of where we are. Section 3, as you see, this actually designates wills, which is current statute, and then revocable governing instruments, which we defined in the document, effective July 1st, 2023. Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to stand for any questions.
Senator Bartle? Any questions? Okay, see no questions at this time. Anyone here would like to testify on this bill? Any further comments on the bill? Anybody online on this bill?
Mr. Chairman, we do have one individual online. If they'd like to testify, if they'd raise their hand.
Sure, let's bring them in. Stay right there, Senator. Yeah. Well. Oh, okay. Oh, I misunderstood. I thought the hand was up. Okay, very good. Looks like no public comment on this bill. Okay, so we'll close public comment. Senator, if you just stay right there, if you have a few moments, in case we have further questions. Members, what's your pleasure on Senate File 100?
Move the bill.
Okay, moved by Representative Northrop, seconded by Representative Swanitzer. Okay, let's work through the bill. Page 1 and then over to page 2. Representative Swanitzer.
I'd like to move an amendment, page 2, line 9, to delete husband and wife and insert spouses. Since it refers to spouses everywhere else in the bill, besides that one section.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, it's been seconded. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? Okay, that's been adopted. Okay, any other amendments on page 2? Okay, moving over to page 3. Okay, page 4. Page 5. Okay, page 6. Page 7. Okay, any further amendments or discussion on the bill? Go ahead, Representative Barrett. Sure, yeah. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Barlow, you mentioned that there are other devices besides the will that are covered in this. And when you were mentioning the will, you talked about the fact that a spouse could go ahead and signify that they wanted their divorced spouse and children to receive benefits. These other instruments, do they have that opportunity in these other instruments? And if so, does this affect that ability to go ahead and predetermine where those benefits are going to go?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the bottom of page 3, line 17, this is the express terms. And those express terms could be in any of the governing documents, which would include wills, other type of pay upon death, et cetera. So, Mr. Chairman, certainly was the intent. If the words need to be clear, but there certainly is the intent that if you designate it, if you firmly designate it, express that you want those benefits to, or property or whatever it is, to continue to go to that ex-spouse, that is what this bill is. That is certainly the intent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Senator Barlow. In the current statute 26118, they did have an interesting sentence on if the divorced spouses remarry to each other, and then all of a sudden, the provisions are revoked solely that are revived by the testator's remarriage to the former spouse. I didn't see any similar language in the bill, but is that just covered on the way the property gets held if they do get remarried?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. Page 6, lines 8 through 10. Or maybe the verbiage is a little different, but it is a similar concept in the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bear,
Aye.
Representative Byron,
Aye.
Representative Locke, Representative Northrup,
Aye.
Representative Oakley.
Aye.
Representative Storer cast an absentee vote of aye. Representative Strack. Aye. Representative Zwanitzer. Thank you. Chairman Harshman. The bill passes 9 ayes.
Good, Senator Case, so we'll just set this back a little bit.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'm returning to that committee right now.
Yeah.
What I will let him know is you're going to take up the next bill and then he will be the last one. Is that acceptable, Mr. Chairman?
That'd be perfect. So we'll
Okay.
move on
All
to
right.
Senate.
Thank
File
you, committee. Thank you,
112.
Mr. Chairman.
Sponsors here. Thank you. I see the good senator walking in the door.
Oh.
So. Right. That's right. Okay. Very good. You're up, Senator. We were just gonna move you back but it's all good. You perfect timing. As usual. Senator, welcome to House Revenue. Appreciate you being here. We're on Senate Joint Resolution 2, so please take us through your resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's one of those days and it's good to see all you guys. Thank you very much. If with your permission, sir, I'd like to set the stage for
Sure.
something that happened in Wyoming history that was just extraordinary. And maybe one of the most important connections with Wyoming, maybe in the past century. And to do that for you, I'd like you to time travel with me a little bit.
Yeah.
Back to June 22nd, 1954. And I want to read you just a little bit of the Cheyenne paper at the time. And this is kind of just extraordinary, Mr. Chairman. Cheyenne was a quiet, respectful city last night as the body of Lester C. Hunt, U.S. Senator, was brought home for funeral services. A silent crowd of hundreds watched as the Air Force DC-6, carrying one of the state's best-loved statesmen, landed. Army National Guard units representing every corner of the state snapped to attention and rendered a final salute to the man who gave more than 20 years of his life to public service. A plane carrying 17 congressional leaders and personal representatives of President Dwight Eisenhower preceded the plane carrying Hunt's body and members of his family. The plane carrying Hunt's body was met by Governor C.J. Rogers, Major General R.L. Ismay, and Dr. P.M. Cunningham. Mrs. Hunt, visibly shaken and tired after the Washington services and the plane ride, was assisted by her son, Lester C. Hunt Jr., and a nephew, William Bourne. She was followed by her daughter, Mrs. Russell Chadwick of Minneapolis, and former Senator Joseph C. O'Mahony, a close friend of the Hunt family. The casket bearing the senator's body was taken from the plane and moved in an honor cortege to the funeral home. preceded by an honor guard composed of Wyoming Army National Guard units, a representative of the 187th Fighter Bomber Squadron of the Air National Guard, and Warren Air Force Base representatives. The cortege moved west on 8th Avenue to Pioneer. So this was last night, which would have been June 21st, 1954. On that day, the United States Congress met briefly in the morning and passed two resolutions, two courtesy resolutions, and then they adjourned. And Senator Hunt's body had been lying in state in the United States Capitol, and then was transported to Episcopal Cathedral in Washington, D.C. for services that would have been held yesterday, this long time ago. 2 days before that was a Saturday morning, and it was June 19th, 1954. Wyoming's United States Senator went into his office building on a Saturday morning. It was typical to work half a day on Saturday, and he met with his staff. Staff wasn't there yet. He entered the building and he carried a rifle, a .22 rifle. The guard noticed the rifle, but didn't really think much of it. That was common. When the senator's chief of staff came in just a little while later, he found the senator lying mortally wounded with a gunshot wound to the head, self-inflicted. They found 4 notes to different people. We don't know what those notes said, but it was a tragedy culminating from a period of time that involved United States Senator Joseph McCarthy. And our Senator Lester Hunt and Joseph McCarthy tangled up kind of right away. Our senator had had an illustrious career. He started out from Lander and he became a state representative. He served in your seats. And then he ran for Secretary of State, served 2 times as Secretary of State. Very popular. He was the fellow that came up with the license plate design on, and he commissioned Alan Tupper True of the same True family that's so prominent in Wyoming to do the bucking horse. The legislature at the time refused to protect the copyright on the bucking horse. So Secretary of State Hunt protected the copyright personally. And people said, well, you're doing that for personal gain, blah, blah, blah. He gave that whole thing to the state, that whole copyright. Served admirably for Secretary of State. Then he ran for governor, and he became a wartime governor during World War II, which is an extraordinary event in and of itself. And he dealt with tremendous challenges in the wartime. You can imagine being a wartime governor, and he appointed all the draft boards. And do you imagine what a hot potato that was, and how you had people that were trying to get in the military and people that were trying to not be getting in the military, and how having to handle all of this and controversies with the draft board? That was about the same time that Hart Mountain Relocation Camp was established. And there were people were very anti-Japanese at that time. It was visceral. And it was charged that the Japanese were getting off easy by having these quarters at the camp, that they had adequate food. And you know, it's unbelievable when you go look at the pictures of what the camp life was like, that people were upset about that. Well, our governor went and investigated the camp and stood up to the people that were saying that they were getting royal treatment. That was a very difficult time. Then a U.S. senator retired, and in the middle of his second term as governor, he ran for the seat and won it. And so that was in 1948 that he started serving that. He died in 1954 in the last year of his first term. He had, by all accounts, would have been reelected. He was popular. There was polling that showed that he was favored to win against potential challenges. But in that Senate career, Mr. Chairman, he got tangled up with Joe McCarthy. And they clashed a bit. They served on a couple committees together, and at least one committee investigating organized crime in America, which is a very prominent committee. They traveled around the country, and Senator Joe McCarthy used this as a grandstanding opportunity for kind of his his allegations about communists in the government. Senator McCarthy, he was later rebuked by the United States Senate. And if you read the official history, he was actually censored by the Senate itself. Extraordinary thing to happen. That came about directly as the consequences of Lester Hunt's suicide, because Joseph McCarthy forced Lester Hunt to commit suicide. He didn't do it directly. He did it through a couple of colleagues that were kind of henchmen in this deal. And their biggest battle, I think, came about because our Senator Hunt was tired of people using the power of the being a senator or member of Congress to hurt people, to call them out and hurt people. So he proposed a bill that would allow citizens to have a private cause of action against libel and slander from politicians. And that was one of the things that kind of broke the straw. The other thing in the context of this time is the makeup of the US Senate was dead even. It was a very important seat. And I haven't mentioned this, but Senator Hunt was a Democrat. And the Republicans, of course, the Eisenhower, the vice president served as, because of the vice president serves as the tiebreaker in the Senate. And so Republicans had a slight advantage, but just one change in seat would make that ironclad. So the Lester Hunt considered running for re-election, and his son Buddy, that's what they called him back in Lander, and that's what he was known as. Buddy was 21 years old, and he was arrested by the DC police for soliciting sex from a male undercover officer. There were lots of allegations about whether that was a frame or entrapment and all this. But at the time, when it was the charges were originally brought, the DC police department, they didn't actually bring the charges. It was just a warning. It was a first offense, and it was kind of lightly handled. But the friends in the other party, maybe they weren't quite so friends, found out about Lester Hunt's mild treatment, and they convinced a detective to bring the charges. And they threatened Senator Hunt with respect to this action, and it ended up they did bring the charges, and Buddy Hunt was convicted. Lester and his wife Natalie sat in the courtroom and stood by their son during the trial. And it happened. It was reported. He was found guilty. It was sort of a minor charge, but it was a big deal back in 1954. That really never made the news back in Wyoming. And in fact, there was evidence that the newspaper guy back in Wyoming, who was a very big fan of Hunt, kind of kept it out of the Wyoming papers. That likely did happen. And then the question, after that, this is where the true blackmail began. And this was unknown for a long time, but it was found by an author who was researching through T.A. Larson's papers at the Archive Center in Laramie. And they found that members of the other party directly threatened Hunt with exposing the events with his son to the people back in Wyoming. And we've all been through recent elections, right? All of you have, obviously, and half the Senate. You know, the mailers that pop in, that drop in, that's not a new thing. They threaten to copy the newspaper stories and mail it to every household in Wyoming. And that was, they were gearing up to do that unless our senator declined to run for the US Congress for re-election. That's how high the stakes were. That's incredible. The nation on a knife edge, and this blatant dirty politics, Mr. Chairman. So in the end, Hunt said he was going to run, stood up to him, but it got to be too much, and he took his own life. And on that Saturday, he's lived for a few more hours. He died. And in 1954, without texting, without the internet, without anything, all these arrangements were made from the White House and the Congress. This was of such national significance. The whole country paused for this. And can you imagine? I mean, there's no way you can even organize a funeral like that today. Congress adjourns after passing courtesy resolutions and appointing members to attend. 2 Air Force planes, the best of their time, are dispatched here. There's a service held on Monday, and he lies in state on Monday. He's brought to Cheyenne, and a service is held in Cheyenne. And he's buried over in Bethel Cemetery, right here off of Pershing. The whole nation. And only about 10 days before, another famous event happened with respect to Joseph McCarthy. There were these investigations about the Army was being charged with, there were charges and countercharges between McCarthy and the United States Army about whether someone got favorable treatment at McCarthy's request, and whether the Army had communists, you know. And there was an attorney for the United States Army. He was a private civilian attorney. And during the hearing, he pushed back on Joseph McCarthy and said, "Have you no decency, sir? Have you no decency?" And that is often credited with kind of being the beginning of the unraveling of Joseph McCarthy. But certainly Lester Hunt's suicide brought it home to the United States Senate and members of Congress. So within a few months, it was less than 6 months later, McCarthy had been investigated and disgraced, and the facts of history bear out the dirty tactics that he did. The facts of history also bear out the facts of why our senator committed suicide. But our senator was a decent man, Mr. Chairman, and he did his best. He was very popular in Wyoming. He was a man above his times, but a man caught up in his times. And then in the end, it proved to be more than he can bear. I don't think he's ever been recognized properly for that time. And it was an ugly time in American political journey. That's why I bring the resolution, sir. I think that there are lessons to be learned from that, but it's also about respecting someone who contributed everything they had to Wyoming. Everything he had. He gave his life, really, when you look at it, you know, and he stood by his family, stood by his son, and he stood by his country. He was, other good things about it's in the resolution. He was a United States veteran. He was an amazing person who came to Lander to be a baseball player of all things. He was the ringer that was recruited for Team Lander. He was a friend of my father's. My father was the Democratic County chairman during the period of Hunt's career. And they were friends. They were actually business partners. They owned a drugstore together. And so in all the years of Hunt's political career, when he was away from Lander, he was a partner with my father and another gentleman. And my dad owed him money. He was buying him out. So when Lester Hunt died, took his own life, my father had already given him a stack of these post-dated checks. And so my father had to get some bank financing and then make good on the post-dated checks. He did that for the widow. And I feel for this person when it says that she was visibly shaken. She covered up the story, the true story of why he killed himself. And she did it probably to protect her son. And then that was the consequences of the days at that time. I'm so glad we're past that now. And good thing, Buddy Hunt had a great life. He lived a long life. He actually married and had children. And so he's just died a few years ago. But I think that Mrs. Hunt must have thought enough of my father, which is a connection here, because she asked him to be an honorary pallbearer at the funeral here in Lander. There was a big list of people, but my dad was here this day when that plane came. Well, we can read it, or I bet you've already read it. And I would hope you would support it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Case. I see Senator Simpson listed in here. I was wondering if you've had the opportunity to talk to him about this, or does he know this is here? Do you know?
Go ahead.
Right. I don't know firsthand if he knows that quote is in here. Senator Simpson frequently leaves me telephone messages. And we connect on occasion. I have not, he's aware of this resolution, and I would bet 100% that he's aware that he's quoted in here. Some folks in the Senate didn't like that he was quoted in here, but Al Simpson belongs to the ages and he belongs to us. And he said this, and he's quoted in books prominently with this quote. There's a Dying for Joe McCarthy's Sins. He's quoted on the flyleaf of that book with this exact quote. So he knows he said it.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sure he'd be proud of it. I just wanted to make sure if he didn't know, I'll make sure he knows.
I think you have a better connection than me. But Mr. Chairman, I have messages where they've got some pretty foul language. And I just love the senators. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing this, Senator. And I'm curious about a couple of things just to get my mind wrapped around this particular the resolution. So you had stated that there's lots of facts that back up these things, and it's been 90 years. And you mentioned one bit of research that happened in Laramie, going through some new newspaper research, I think you said. But some of these things, like for instance, on page 3, it starts on line 18. It's talking about the hearings. And that's where Lester Hunt was introduced to the bullying and false accusation tactics of Senator Eugene McCarthy and his followers. But yet the censuring that happened to McCarthy doesn't seem to address those particular issues. It doesn't seem. So I'm just curious, are we putting something in here that is hearsay, or has this really been researched? And where can we find that research to determine that this is factual?
Senator?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. The historical connection with the suicide was developed by T.A. Larson. He was a professor at the University of Wyoming, and his papers are in the American Heritage Collection. And a researcher going through those found the actual accounts of and the documentation about the suicide and the cause for the suicide. The backstory is that Professor Larson had contacted and shared his writings with Mrs. Hunt. And she did not want that released, and she threatened to sue T.A. Larson if he brought that forward, the actual proof about the suicide. So they laid it in the papers for years, and then they were finally found. Believe it or not, Buddy Hunt, all these years, Mr. Chairman, thought that his father committed suicide because he was gay. And you know, that's the tragedy in and of itself, where things get twisted about between families and trying to protect people and things. So Mrs. Hunt, trying to protect Buddy, ended up kind of hurting Buddy in a way. With regard to the other facts, there's incredible amounts of documentation about McCarthy's tactics, about the Senate hearings that were held. There's transcripts. There's even a bit of film in some instances. And Senator McCarthy alleged that there were communists in all aspects of government. That's very well documented. But he never, it's documented, Representative Baer, that he said there were communists, but what's not documented is Senator McCarthy was never able to document the actual communists. It was always a fictitious list. So many there, so many here. And he was a bully about it. He was a tyrant. And if anybody challenged his numbers, he and his henchmen called them communist sympathizers. And that's well documented. They just, you know, instead of proving facts, they just charged in and called them names. We would probably have names for other people today, but back then the communist sympathizer was like one of the worst things you could do. You're interfering with my investigation. You're asking me questions. You're a communist sympathizer. Very well documented, sir. Documented in the Senate's own history. If you go to the US Senate's historical page about McCarthy, it's right there. And I can share that with you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senator, in the whereas statements here, we're talking about we're going to recommit to respect and these other things, which seem like they were an example of Lester Hunt's life. And
Yes, sir.
We're trying to bring that into what we're doing. You mentioned that this was a very contentious time, that the Senate was very even. We just recently had an election that was nationally noticed, if you will. Do you believe that during that election that some of the kind of things that you're putting into this resolution were happening? And is that part of the motivation for this resolution?
Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to recognize a great man that I think we've lost track of. I think we lost track of the lessons of his life. I think the lessons of his life are applicable in all aspects of our life. I'm not trying to set the stage about our current time, but I do think we all know that it's an edgy time among our members, among our colleagues in each chamber, and it's been an edgy bit of time. Maybe we could find some comfort from what happened to a great man a long time ago. I'm not saying the same thing's happening now, but I'm saying we can hold him up as a beacon to how we should be treating each other and making our government work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just last question. You mentioned that his wife, for purposes that, you know, for her family, protecting her family, she didn't want certain things revealed. Even maybe the paper, when they talked about on that day that you reminded us of, that it wasn't mentioned what had happened at that time. So obviously it was a different time. We covered up things that were considered untoward at that time. You mentioned that, thank goodness now we're not in that time. So I guess my question is, I consider one thing in his past, the eugenics piece,
You bet.
to be a bit of a negative.
Certainly is, Mr. Chairman.
Should we in this day, when we're more open about things, should we mention that here?
Mr. Chairman, this resolution is in your possession and you can, it is absolutely true that as a freshman legislator in the Wyoming House of Representatives, that Lester Hunt supported eugenics legislation, and it's terrible practice. And eugenics, for people that don't know, it's really can take various forms, but it's practiced in America, and it was very popular in America at the time, was the sterilization of people that they felt were inferior. I will say to our good senator's credit, he recanted from that. He said it was a mistake. He expressed remorse about that. It was not an unusual thing at that time. There were many laws that where for example, people with developmental disabilities were sterilized at the cost of the state. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that. And I think that's important piece, but it's also important that he expressed remorse about that. And he said that that was a mistake. And, you know, I'm a religious man. I believe in forgiveness. And I think forgiveness starts with the individual asking for it, and he asked for it. So, but Lester Hunt was not perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Chair would like to speak on this resolution. Yeah, come forward, you bet. And is there anyone online? Ask them to raise their hand if they want to speak on this. Okay. So I think Mr. Garrett's going to bring us home. Public comment. Anybody else here, raise your hand just so I get a sense. Okay. Morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Richard Garrett. I live here in Cheyenne. Lived in Lander before that. And Senator Case was my senator for, I believe, about 20 years. I can assure you that Senator Case comes from a very honest place with this resolution. In conversations over the years, he has expressed a great deal of admiration and respect for Senator Governor Hunt. So he's not new to this, not at all. I know that each of you serve with dignity and realize a great deal of rewards as a result of your service. I also know, I'm sure, that you are often the target of things that I wish you didn't have to absorb as public servants. So I'm grateful to you for your service. I look as old as dirt, I suppose. I'm not quite that old, but Senator Hunt was the first senator of my life, believe it or not. And my parents used to tell me of Senator Hunt's service when I was growing up. And his story is one that I've known for a very long time. I'd only observe, I suppose, that today is Random Act of Kindness Day. And this is your acceptance and vote in favor of this resolution is anything but random, but it would be truly kind and honor a person that I think honored our state and for whom we should be grateful. If we don't know where we've been, we can't possibly know where we're going. And this will remind us where we've been. So with that, Mr. Chairman and members, any questions?
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Garrett? Hey,
Thank you.
thank you for your testimony this morning. Appreciate you being here. Okay, very good. Any other public testimony? Okay, so we'll close public comment on Senate Joint Resolution number 2. Members, what's your pleasure?
Move the resolution.
Okay, it's been moved by Representative Zwanitzer and seconded by Vice Chair Oakley. Members, we'll just flip through the resolution. You have any suggested amendments on page 1 or page 2? Interesting history on the bucking horse and rider.
1936.
And okay, page 3. Okay, page 4. Okay, page 5. And page 6. And finally, page 7. Okay. Any further discussion on the resolution? Representative Bear?
I'd just like to make a statement, Mr. Chairman, that, and I'll probably, if this passes, I'll go ahead and get with the bringer of the resolution. I just have concerns about some of the historical accuracy and just it seems like it's been a long time and a lot of things were covered up. I'd like to know, just how accurate this is if we're gonna put this on our record. And that's really all I have to say about that.
On Senate Joint Resolution 2 has no amendment.
Okay. Representative Bear,
No.
Representative Byron,
Aye.
Representative Locke, Representative Northrup,
Aye.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Storer cast an aye vote absentee. Representative Strock cast an absentee vote of no. Representative Zwanitzer, Chairman Harshman. The bill passes with 6 ayes and 3 noes.
Our next bill is Senate File 112, peer support counseling confidentiality. We have the good Chairman, Senator Nethercott. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good to be with House Revenue Committee. I think this is the first time I've ever spoken to a Revenue Committee with a bill draft. Mr. Chairman, I do have with me Cheyenne's finest Chief of Police here, Mark Francisco, to join me with this legislation with your permission. Wonderful. With that, I'll go ahead and proceed with Senate File 112. Good representatives, as you may know, the mental health of our first responders is near and dear to my heart, and legislation I have worked on throughout my career. And this is part of that effort as well. Big picture for what this bill does. There's no fiscal impact. There's no mandate on any agency, but it does allow for those first responder agencies, which is defined in the bill. So law enforcement, fire departments, and other types of first responders, for those that have a peer support type of a program, that those communications with peer support specialists are allowed to be confidential under statute. And the purpose of that really is hopefully obvious to you, but really to allow for free and candid communications between officers or first responders who have experienced a traumatic event to speak with their peers, not a professional counselor or anyone else, but to speak with their peers about what they have experienced, because they are more likely to do that than sometimes professionals. And to ensure, though, that those communications that they do have in those settings remain confidential. So an important bill, I think, to protect and to further advance our first responders' mental health protections. As we know, they experience profound trauma on a fairly regular basis in Wyoming from a variety of reasons, whether it be from our roads and highways or from violent events or other traumatic circumstances of which they are exposed. And so this bill draft was brought to me at the request of those agencies who have these types of programs in order to ensure that those protections are in place statutorily. So with that, we will walk through the bill. Predictably, we start with definitions, which I think is helpful and important. So going on to page 2, we really have to who this bill applies to, and one is emergency services personnel. You can see that definition is referenced in other areas of our statute there. Then we have an employee assistance program. So that's the program we're talking about. So for those agencies that have it, again, it's not a mandate, but those who want to have it and do, this is who that applies to for these types of programs. We're going down the page is a law enforcement agency. Page 3 is a law enforcement officer. And then importantly here is on page 3, lines 11 through 15, is the definition of a peer support counseling session, which means any session conducted by a peer support specialist that is called or requested in response to a critical incident or traumatic event involving the personnel of the law enforcement agency or emergency service provider. It's very specific kind of sideboards associated with when this applies and when these sessions are in effect. And then also very important to this bill is who can be a peer support specialist, recognizing very clearly that these are not counselors, and the counselors want to make sure that this is clear for you as well, so that there's no confusion about this term counseling that they're uncomfortable with generally, but using it kind of in the layman's sense and the way that officers would use it on the field, that this is actually what's occurring on the ground. So here's a peer support specialist. It's a person who is designated by a law enforcement agency or emergency services provider, or an EAP, employee assistance program, or peer support team leader to lead, moderate, or assist in a peer support counseling session. Is a member of a peer support team. Going on to page 4, if you're following along, has received training in counseling and providing emotional and moral support to law enforcement officers. And then there's a definition of peer support team. And importantly, too, for our counselors, an amendment made over on the Senate side on page 4, lines 14 through 16, we see the definition of what peer support counseling is not. And those are sessions with a licensed professional counselor, which of course, those communications, of course, are confidential as well, but recognizing that someone who's a member of a peer support team is not necessarily a licensed professional counselor. And so here is the purpose of the bill going on the bottom of page 4, which is the confidentiality of those communications. So any oral or written information conveyed in one of those sessions is to be deemed confidential and shall be confidential and cannot be disclosed by anyone who's part of that. Here are some exceptions to that going on to page 5. Any communications between peer support specialists relating to a peer support counseling session shall be confidential, not disclosed. We covered that. So it shall not apply on the bottom of page 5 to public records either. As we know, those agencies are subject to public records requests. Many of them are. So again, excluding them from the Public Records Act request concerning maybe who these officers and their personnel type records. Page 6 is really the definitions of where it shall not apply. So if there is a threat of suicide or a criminal act, obviously appropriate responses need to be made in regarding those types of communications. This is consistent with other types of confidential communications that are made with actual counselors or anyone else. Information relating to the abuse of spouses or children, admissions of criminal conduct. It's important to recognize that some of these disclosures may be subject to court disclosure, and it's important to recognize that statute may not be able to protect those requirements for disclosure in a court of law. And really, good senators, that's the bill, or representatives, that's the bill, and happy to answer questions, or if not, I defer to the good chief.
That old. Can't say that anymore.
You can.
Gonna have to come up with a new one. I think it was, learned that from Hank Coe, I think, back in the. Okay, chief, I just want to make sure, can you spell your name? I just want to make sure I have this right. Welcome, appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir. As soon as I find the on button here, my name, Mark Francisco, MARKFRANCISCO.
Francisco.
Yes, sir.
Chief, appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate the Revenue Committee's hearing this very important issue that's near and dear to my heart. Just by way of a little bit of background of myself, I've been in law enforcement for 32 years. So I think that makes me old enough to be here, unfortunately. And have been serving as the chief of police here in Cheyenne for 2 years. At the beginning of my career, these kind of mental health services were practically non-existent. So I've seen them grow over the years. In the latest iteration, although it's been around for decades in a lot of places, is peer support. The notion that the comfort level of speaking to a fellow traveler, if you will, is a lot more likely to be used, which is the goal of all of these programs, is to give many tools in the toolbox for first responders to take advantage of mental health services. What we've noticed over the years is that there was a bit of distrust of the process, in that officers weren't comfortable that their conversations would remain private. Many agencies, including the Cheyenne Police Department, have attempted to address that with confidentiality statements within policy, which is all fine and good and has been helpful. But what has become apparent around the country is that that does not protect conversations in state court, which can be a concern for officers. They spend a lot of time in the legal system, and they don't necessarily want to become a part of it unnecessarily. So that has led to the really the best practice institution of creating these confidentiality bills, and several states have done so. The federal government has also done so for their first responder type employees. So we have approached the senator with this conversation about instituting this confidentiality statement here in Wyoming. So that's it in a nutshell, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this really could go to either of you. So obviously this is, the idea behind this is to protect, these law enforcement or firemen or whatever that are stepping up to be a part of this and help their peers. But has there been any discussion about if there would be a downside on it being weaponized against them? And I was thinking just yesterday, there was a lawyer with training on what is and is not confidential information, for example, was censured for disclosing information in a pleading. So I'm wondering if there's been discussion about the possible negative consequences for the people stepping up, willing to be these peer support specialists, if there could be a negative side for them willing to do that.
I was hoping the senator would go first, but I'll give that a stab. Mr. Chairman, I think that is always a risk. However, in my personal opinion, it's a risk worth taking. Anytime you have legislation, and this is no surprise to you all who craft these items, the court is the ultimate decider on these things. So there is always a chance that there could be an unintended consequence. But in my personal opinion, it's a chance worth taking, in that, over the years, I've been to too many funerals. Even here in Wyoming, I've only been here 2 years, and I've been to some here. And anything we can do to, strengthen the ability of our first responder members to take advantage of any kind of mental health services, I think is worth taking a stab at. My only other experience with this type of legislation that had not come up yet, there had not been an issue, but it's very difficult to predict the future for sure.
Mr. Chairman, certainly law enforcement and first responders are familiar with recognizing risk and applying discretion appropriately. So I do think that they will be more confident in stepping up and participating in these types of programs, either as a peer support specialist or as a person receiving the benefits of it in a counseling session, and know that they pore over the statutes as closely as lawyers do, and recognizing that those protections are there, and including arguably consequences for that. I think if an officer were to violate the confidentiality provision, I do think that there would be disciplinary action, I would hope, at least from an agency associated with that type of violation of law or potential policy. Further exposure or risk to them, I think is minimal, and certainly their own conduct they must be responsible for.
I think Representative Locke had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation today. And my question is fairly simple. So it sounds like this process of this peer counseling is in place and is currently used. And my question has kind of been migrating as you've been talking here, is because you've been explaining this a little bit more. So you said that in policy, you kind of have this confidentiality within this organization now, but I think you may have just said it. Is it an issue that lack of confidence that will hold up where it needs to hold up? Is that kind of the issue that gives them lack of comfort with it in the absence of it being in statute? Is that where we're falling down, and maybe the process is being weakened?
Senator or Chief, maybe both of you.
If I could just weigh in, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Obviously, confidentiality in my organization is one thing that myself and my staff can control, but once it gets out of the realm of the police department and into any kind of state court action, then policy doesn't certainly supersede state law. So that's why this extra step is needed in the eyes of many to give that confidence level that your conversations with a trained peer support specialist are confidential.
Yeah, I would just back that up and say, in my observation, there's no other profession that pays attention to the green books more than lawyers and legislators. And that's law enforcement officers, right? They hold those green books in the highest regard, right? Because they're enforcing those laws. And so what it says matters and affects their behavior and of course, everyone else's behavior around them as well. So I think it's a powerful tool that they're asking for from the agencies themselves, recognizing that this is a concern that has been brought forth by officers. The failure to have it in statute would really just provide those greater protections to allow for freer and more candid communications.
Okay, further questions, committee? Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question I have for you, Chief, just on page 7 here, on section G, it's the very end, and it's talking about communications with, I assume it's going to be supervisors in regards to fitness of an employee for duty. And I can imagine why those conversations would need to be had based on the counseling with the peer, but will that stifle the communications with this peer counseling, in your opinion?
Okay, go ahead. We'll just keep going that same order, Chief, and then Senator. Alphabetical.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't believe it would stifle that. I think that what that's trying to distinguish is that if an employee is having observable work-related issues, management, of course, is still free to seek remedies to that, whether it be directing someone to go to our counselor that we employ to determine if they're fit for duty. So I think what we're trying to distinguish is we still have, as management, we still have obligations to make sure that our employee out there is performing as they should be. What we don't want out of this is the conversation between the peer support specialist to then be pushed up the chain of command, if you will. That's what we're trying to avoid. However, these folks doing these jobs all have supervisors. They all have a chain of command. So when we notice an issue outside of the peer support realm, we're still obligated to ensure that the employee is meeting the standards while serving the public. So that's the communication we're referring to here between us and our employed mental health counselor or really any other avenue that we might take to ensure that our employees fit for duty.
Senator, you want to add to that or good? Okay. Very good. Okay, any other questions, members? Okay, is there any public comment? Anybody here to testify? And is there anybody online that wants to testify on this, just so we kind of get a sense of our time?
Mr. Chairman, we do have one person online with their hand up.
Okay, so we'll take care of everybody in the room here first and then. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Byron Odikoven, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs, rising in support of the bill. We first looked at this issue when Chief Francisco brought it to us with the idea of the confidentiality and wondered, why didn't we do this a long time ago? Was our first thought, because all other aspects of therapy, if you will, or counseling with first responders is confidential. We've migrated toward, I think if you remember years ago, we talked about critical incident debriefing. What happens when officers get together to review actions on a critical incident and look at ways to improve or to correct or to look at things in a different light for how things happen. And it was a logical progression to go to that individual, that peer support discussion, which is where that counseling has migrated to. So it's likewise intuitive to add that level of confidentiality to that next level of migration of therapy for first responders. As was mentioned, it's very stressful. And in these times, some members of the public and some organizations put a lot of pressure on law enforcement and seek to undermine the authority, if you will, for civil order and preserving the peace. So it carries a lot of stress with those actions, and anything we can do to mitigate some of that stress, to help with that level of understanding, to ensure that officers are doing a good job as we would expect them to do. It's in our best interest to provide that support to them to ensure that they do that in the long haul, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Odiko, questions? Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just gonna give you the same question I gave the chief. I just want to know if you have any concerns about this section G as far as it stifling communication. I'll just read it to you. This section shall not prohibit communications regarding the fitness of an employee for duty between the employee assistance program and an employer. Do you have any concerns with that stifling communications between the employee and the counselor?
Director Odiko.
Mr. Chairman, let me take a slightly different slant from the previous answer and would suggest that officers are duty bound to speak to their supervisor on fitness for duty of their coworker under all circumstances.
Duty bound.
So
For everybody's safety.
for everyone's safety, including their fellow coworkers. So it cuts across a lot of lines that you are duty bound to cover the fitness for duty of an officer. So I would suggest that the peer counselor would have a heightened responsibility to do just that. They're having that individual conversation. So on one hand, it's confidential until it crosses that threshold of fitness for duty, and then they're duty bound, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Good discussion. Any questions? Anybody want to add? I think you've all, just for members of the committee, maybe knew your background and been the director for some time, but.
Sorry, this whole issue is a little sensitive to me based on many of the events that have happened over the course of my career, directing officers through them. So my career, 12 and a half years with the city of Gillette, up through the ranks. I worked a K-9 officer on the street, downtown foot patrol, looking at 5 different bars during the boom. Kind of a different time, to say the least. Up to the patrol commander, in charge of the all uniform division within the city of Gillette. On to be the elected sheriff for 16 years in Campbell County. 110 employees, a jail, host of issues, again, during the boom and growth in Gillette, seeing quite a bit. FBI National Academy graduate, Northwestern University Staff and Command graduate, bachelor's degree in law enforcement. The hard way, if you will, as a non-traditional student at nights, weekends, internet, correspondence courses for some of you who may be old enough to remember that discussion. But nonetheless, the hard way, Mr. Chairman, and most recently, as you know, for a number of years, as the executive director for the association, proud that we have a joint association in Wyoming of sheriffs and chiefs. That's uncommon. That's only 3 additional states, or we're one of 3 states, excuse me, to do that. Washington State, Nevada, and Wyoming have a joint association. So I think it's helpful for the legislature when I come to you representing both sheriffs and chiefs for these discussions, Mr. Chairman.
How many, not to grill, but you showed up so we can ask you questions.
Mr. Chairman.
How long have you been, were you in Gillette? I mean, were you a native of Campbell County?
Yes, sir. Born in the hospital in Gillette, when I think it only had 5 rooms, Mr.
I mean,
Chairman.
it's a
and
leading question. I know this. So when did your ancestors come to Campbell County?
Thank you. Oedikovens came on the Oedikoven side, if you will, from Germany. Across on the ship, there were 16 kids in my grandfather's era. Most of them were fairly prolific. They initially settled outside the fort in Bear Butte, South Dakota, now known as Sturgis. And when prior to the Homestead Act, several of the older great uncles were riders for the range or the big outfits in Wyoming, and said when the Homestead Act opened, they would settle in Wyoming on good grass. So the family ended up in northern Campbell County predominantly, unfortunately without much oil, coal, or gas, but we did have good grass, Mr. Chairman, so helped in the early stages. So thank you.
Yeah, very good. Appreciate you being here. Any further questions of the chief? Okay, thanks for being here. I think if you can give up your seat, we have a fellow first responder to testify. Good morning.
I represent the vast majority of career firefighters, and we protect the majority of Wyoming's population responding to EMS, hazmat rescue, and fire calls. We support Senate File 112. As previous speakers have stated, over the last couple of decades, mental health has really come to the forefront. 9/11 was really an eye-opening in the fire service as to the effects of mental health. And through that, we've established peer support teams in our various organizations, including here in Wyoming. We've trained almost 24 peer support firefighters in 4 different departments in conjunction with our employers. And this bill that is protecting these confidential discussions dealing with mental health is crucial to get firefighters to open up and seek the mental health treatment that a lot of them desperately need. They say about 85% of firefighters over the course of a career will exhibit at least one symptom of PTSD. Approximately 40% of firefighters have had suicidal ideations. 20% have a plan. So mental health is a huge aspect of our service, and this bill would help protect that mental health. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Any questions, Mr. Reddy? Hey, what high school did you go to?
Natrona County and Casper.
Yeah,
Counties.
yeah, very good. Well, we appreciate your years of service. So, any questions? Okay, anyone else here in the room would like to testify on this bill? Okay, seeing none, we have one online. We can open up the Zoom and
Mr. Chairman, I'm admitting Tara Mueller.
was that Tara or Kara? Tara with a T. Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Morning, can you hear us?
Good morning. I can, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'll be brief. We certainly support this bill 100%. Mental health, trauma for our first responders who do some of the hardest work in our state certainly deserve this kind of protection. I just want to raise one small issue, and it's coming from our programs that work with survivors of domestic violence. On page 6, line 14, where there are exceptions to what doesn't have to be confidential, that 2 little I section refers to abuse of spouses, children, or the elderly. There's no mandate anywhere in Wyoming law that domestic violence must be reported. Our work as advocates is we have our own protection of confidentiality for victims. And we'd like to make sure that that's consistent through our Wyoming state law. So because there's no mandatory reporting nature in Wyoming for domestic violence, we'd like on line 14 to delete the words of spouses. Mostly because if you're a victim first, if you're a first responder being victimized by domestic violence, hopefully there's wonderful internal procedures to get you help, get a safety plan. If you're committing domestic violence, you certainly would be covered under line 18, the admission of criminal conduct. The ramifications are all about safety, and our programs have really expressed the concern that there's plenty of domestic violence among first responders, as there is in our general population, and victims should be protected in those safe spaces that we've heard about this morning. And that's all I have to say. I'm hoping you'll consider that. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, committee? Representative Zwanitzer has a question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted Ms. Muir to introduce herself and who she's with. You might not see her as often as I do in my committee. And I don't think she announced who she was with.
Go ahead. Can you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Tara Muir. I am the Public Policy Director with the Wyoming Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault. We have a network of programs in every county in Wyoming who do the crisis call, crisis lines, and help people with protection orders, help people safety plan to get through what they're facing. And it's extremely important when there's a law enforcement officer involved that victim not have repercussions, not have that disclosure. I think good Representative Oakley used the word weaponized. And with domestic abuse, a lot of things can be weaponized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Okay, thank you for joining us today. Very good. Okay, anyone else? I think we've exhausted public comment. Okay, we're going to close public comment. If you two would stay right there in case you have further questions. You're not off the hot seat yet, so appreciate you being here and your presentation. Okay, members, what's your pleasure on Senate File 112?
Move the bill.
Second. Been moved by Representative Byron and seconded by Representative Northrop. Okay, let's work the bill, page 1 to page 2. Okay, and page 3. Flipping over to page 4. Page 5. Okay, page 6. Okay, and page 7. There any amendments? Page, nothing on page 8. Page Representative Zwanitzer.
Just a quick question, Mr. Chairman. Any reason to make it effective immediately? Are there current programs? I just thought I'd double check with the sponsor if doesn't look like there's any rules or regs to do, so just thought I would ask.
Go ahead. Doesn't harm us in the little process going back and forth. That's the only thing
Yeah.
you know. Okay. Okay, any amendments? Okay,
I don't need to make it if nobody else cares. I just wanted to double check.
okay, very good. Last call for amendment. Okay. Okay, please call the roll, Ms. Jeffrey, on Senate File 112 with no amendments.
Representative Bear,
Aye.
Representative Byron.
Aye.
Representative Locke, Representative Northrop, Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Storer cast an I vote absentee, and Representative Strock cast an I vote absentee. Representative Zwanitzer. Chairman Harshman. The bill passes 9 I votes.
Very good. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate your presentation, your good service.
Thank
Chief. Okay, thank you all. Okay, no other business before the committee. So I'll next week, Tuesday, Thursday, I'll get out a meeting notice here on Friday for next Tuesday, since the legislature is not in session on Monday. And we'll see what bills get sent to us today. So, okay, so thank you all for your good work and have a wonderful weekend and a great day.